Teleportation will commence in 5 minutes. Do not leave any luggage unattended. Unattended luggage will be removed and destroyed. Attention, ladies and gentlemen. This is an announcement from planet X31. Please take your seats. Teleportation will commence in 2 minutes.
Atoms, like each other, to different degrees. Lots of things you see here that are like
Good evening, Earthlings, and welcome to the Science and Cocktails. Science and Cocktails is an initiative taken in collaboration with the Niels Bohr Institute that tries to bring scientific research directly to the people without interference of any other type of intermediate media. It tries to create a night culture that evolves around knowledge, entertainment, discussion, cocktails, and art. Tonight's lecture will be given by Professor Albert Gjedde, head of the Institute for Pharmacology and Neuroscience at Copenhagen University and one of the leading scientists in the field of consciousness. He has recently been awarded the Danish Prize for Science Communication. Please, let's give a big applause to Professor Albert Gjedde. Clap, 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 clap. talk will be about the purpose of the brain, free will, subjectivity, and consciousness. Later, a sound artist and electronic music composer, Sos Kunver Rubak, will create intense turmoil in the audience's mind. She will perform some of her compositions that consist on field recordings mixed with electronic sounds that transform into an intense physical music. End of discussion.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? And I'm not in control of this. Someone on the planet X31 is controlling this, but I think it's better now. Thank you very much for having me here and for all of you to come here tonight. I am a little bit overwhelmed by the whole setup, and so I hope that you will bear with me. The last time I was here was in the early months of 1965. I had been called before the auditors of the Danish army. Auditors are people who observe the law. And I was called in here to stand before some people because I had written a newspaper article where I made certain claims that they considered to be insulting about the Danish army where I served at the time. I was so shocked by the whole setup that I must admit that I have not been back since, until tonight. And I have been asked to and would like to talk to you about what brains are for, why we have brains. And of course the issue about brains is that not all living forms have brains. For example, plants do not have brains usually. They may have, they don't have a nervous system either. And that's perhaps one of the clues why organisms that can move why they have brains, or why they develop nervous systems. And it's been said that the main reason that brains have developed is because you can move. And there are organisms, as you probably know, that start out life as animals and are able to move and have a nervous system, and then they settle down on a rock somewhere in the ocean and become essentially a plant. And they eat their own nervous system because even though they may harbor some, let's say, desires not to be attacked or not to be the victims of various events, there's very little they can do about it in terms of moving. So one of the main reasons that animals have brains, have nervous systems, is then likely to be because we can move. So in terms of this is supposed to work like that. So the first answer to what brains are for is to serve movement. And much of what the brain does serves one of the main questions that has to do with movement. Because when I speak of movement in terms of brains, I speak of the finest movements to have an eyebrow that is slightly raised, to certain movements of the lips, of the cheeks to all the way to the most massive physical exertion that involves running at top speed through the landscape. And whenever this thing about movement comes up, whenever the opportunity to move anything from an eyebrow to the whole body, there's one question that has to be answered first and foremost, namely, where to move. And other questions immediately arise as a consequence of this fundamental question, namely, how fast to move there, when to move there, because it doesn't necessarily have to be now, it could be tomorrow, or it could be next week or next year. And then perhaps the most fundamental of the questions, why move there? So all the way, and finally what the consequences would be of the movement that you're undertaking. Even the raising of an eyebrow is likely to have consequences that could be important to you and to mankind around you. So all these questions have to be answered, and the movement has to be planned, and it has to happen in such a way that your chances of survival are maximized. So this is perhaps at the core of what brains are for. Brains optimize movements, and they optimize the consequences of movements. So when brains developed and nervous systems developed throughout evolution, the most likely explanation is that they did exactly that. They developed, they evolved because they optimized the chances of survival of a particular species. And if we think about the evolution of animals, there is a number of fundamental drives that have driven animals from the most primordial existence at in the ocean all the way to the seashore and then further up. And these were, it's put very nicely here, but I would say that these three drives are eat, fight, and fuck. And if you do that, at least you have a fighting chance of being able to pass on your genes to the next generation. And it is interesting that almost all animal species that are not under the protection of others have had to fight starvation, disease, and the aspirations, let's say, or ambitions of other animals. In fact, it's even said about humans that there were a time, a bottleneck, when there were 800 humans left. It's been calculated. And that we all stem from these 800 somewhere in East Africa about 100,000 years ago. So, and the reason that these drives have been so important is that even for humans, until about 200 years ago, starvation for all humans, as it is for many even today, starvation was the reality of the day. And even in Denmark 200 years ago, only half of all children survived to the age of 14. So if you were able to satisfy these three drives, and you were able to do them in the right order, there was the possibility of perpetuating your particular species. But then something happened. A fourth drive developed, and that's the one I would like to focus on. The fourth drive had to do with the attempt to, or the drive to understand how the world is constructed, how the world, the pieces of the world come together, and what determines how the world works. And of course, if you have to use or have your brains because of the contingencies and the demands put on movement to understand how the world works, is going to improve your chances of meeting the adverse events that you, because of your understanding of the world, know with a certain probability you are going to face in the future, and prepare yourself for it. So, and everything you do to prepare yourself for the future involves movement, obviously. Whether you're building a house or a dike, whether you are building machines that will allow you to do agriculture, all the other kinds of things depend on understanding how the world, the pieces of the world hang together and what makes the world tick. And I would say that this quest for understanding is fundamentally a quest for meaning. The meaning of the pieces of the world. And there, humans, perhaps together with primates, appear to be in a very unique league. And I'm going to give you an example, which you are probably familiar with. This is Calvin and Hobbes. And you know Calvin, you know that Hobbes is a tiger. He may, some evil tongues say that he's really a stuffed tiger, but as an example of what I would like to discuss with you, I think this is an excellent example, because the tiger is a magnificent animal. It's one of the most impressive and beautiful of animals. And it is one that has been used as a symbol of power and empire for all times. But the tiger is a very limited animal in its possibilities, because evolution has designed it to exist and survive in a particular niche. And if this niche is tampered with, if this niche disappears because of influences from the outside, the tiger perishes, does not survive, except to the extent that we are capable of protecting the tiger in zoological gardens or in special parks, national parks, and still the tiger is on the list of potentially extinguished animal species. So despite its magnificence, its power, it is an animal that seems to be able to survive in only one place. And even if the tiger should somehow harbor ideas of how to improve its lot, it's incapable of doing so. Unlike Calvin. Calvin is a generalist. He belongs to a species of animals that are generalists. The tiger is a specialist, designed to survive in a particular niche. Calvin is different. Calvin is a generalist, apparently designed to be able to live almost anywhere on this planet as well as on other planets. At the very least, as you saw on the moon, in which the generalist capabilities and skills of this particular species have enabled these humans to meet adversities on this planet as well as on the moon, to the extent that they have been able to survive, perhaps even to the extent that this may be detrimental to other species. So what is it about the generalist species of humans that is so important? And you can take the moon travel as an example, because it requires an intimate knowledge of how certain things work together, how the interaction between planets, physics, all the elements, they tick. And this insight has come because there has been a desire among the people who acquired this insight, which forms a body of meaning to the extent that the ultimate experiment was possible, to actually design rockets, design speeds, design pathways to the extent, and even designing clothing to the extent that this travel and the survival on the moon actually succeeded. And the people who acquired this insight and also the ambition, of course, were driven by this primary, this fourth of these things that urge us, motivate us to do things, namely the quest for meaning. And I think that we can see this quest for meaning, we can see that in a number of contexts, because it is probably the same drive that drives artists, composers, authors, religious fanatics, and scientists, namely this attempt to be able to say, now I understand, to the extent that I can actually predict the future with a certain degree of probability. And not only can I predict the future, but I can use these predictions to evaluate specific courses of action. I can prepare and plan, and if my insight into how the world is likely to be and what challenges it's likely to present in the next period of time, then I can change things. I can change my niche. I can change the environment. I can build dikes and bridges and houses, and humanity can do all of these things that within a certain degree of probability makes it possible to optimize, within, of course, the given context, our chances of survival as individuals as well as a species. And the organ that appears to be able to do this, namely predicting the details of the future on the basis of an intimate knowledge of what makes the world tick, as well as to evaluate various ways of interacting with the environment and changing it such that the odds increase in our favor, so that the odds are ever in our favor. And this, of course, is this organ, the brain, that has been a mysterious entity until almost exactly 200 years ago. Until 200 years ago, there was very little exact knowledge of what this organ looked like because of these gyri and the spaces between the gyri. They're called gyri, and these sulci between the gyri. They seemed to be so haphazard and so unstandardized, so to speak, that the ancients would draw them as clouds, kind of and they were concerned that such a strange-looking thing, whether that could possibly be an organ of importance and significance. And I would like to know how many in here have seen a living brain? There are perhaps 5 hands. How many have seen a living human brain? I say living human brain. Some arms went down. And the final clincher, of course, how many in here have seen a completely healthy, normal, living human brain? Practically no one. Certain neurosurgeons occasionally misjudge and therefore feast their eyes on a normal brain, but I hope it's not too often. But other than those few instances, the brain has been protected behind this hard skull. And the ancients, of course, only saw the brain and were able to observe it after it no longer worked, because it had the soul, so to speak, had escaped from these brains. And when you do that, when you look at it in its almost de-souled state, it looks like, depending on how you keep it, it looks like 3 pounds of something that looks like porridge. And it has the consistency of cold porridge from yesterday. And it was not a very formidable organ. It was not an organ that inspired, confidence. And even Aristotle, as you know, he thought that it looked more like a radiator. And what do radiators do? Well, sometimes they cool things and sometimes they heat them up. But that this organ served the cooling of the blood because of its appearance. But the main portions of this, I think you should know, because it's divided into a few functional entities that have been given names by, and this is the main subdivisions. Here's the frontal lobe, and here is the foremost part of the frontal lobe is the prefrontal lobe, temporal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the parietal lobe. And there's some other parts of the brain, the cerebellum, that we will not go into. And we now pretty well know, and here they are. We now pretty well know that the occipital lobe is the primary seat of the visual sense. Temporal lobe is for the auditory sense, and the parietal lobe is the primary seat for the sense of touch, being able to perceive being touched. But the question about the frontal lobe, in particular the prefrontal lobe, has not been as easy to discover, and that's what I will concentrate on in the talk, to try to understand how this ability of the brain to assist us, the individual, in planning our future movements in such a way that the odds are increased, how we can think of that. And that takes place within that particular property of the brain, as far as you know, known as consciousness. And consciousness is a property which allows us to form in our mind's eye images called imaginations, as we shall see, of the future, based on memory, memorized, stored experiences of the past. What about the present? Well, you may think that we are in the present right now, at present. But the thing about the present is, of course, that it is extremely brief. The present, in fact, some would say does not per se exist. The moment the future passes to the past is an imperceptible interface. So whatever you think you are now experiences in the present is actually more or less, of course, I agree with that, more or less in the past. It happened in the last few milliseconds, or it lasted, or it happened before that, long before that, and it's been said that we use most of our time when we are awake in passing back and forth from the past to the future and back to the past. In fact, it's been said, if a speaker does not say anything provocative with a frequency of at least every 5 seconds, all our minds will begin to wander. And you will start thinking about things that are either in the future or in the past. And only the moment your mind perceives some sort of a provocation or a threat will it focus, let's say, on that part of the past that happened just a few moments ago. And people speak of highway hypnosis, and you may have, even though you live here, you may occasionally have driven a car on a motorway. And of course, we all experience the situation where you've been driving along a motorway, a freeway in Jutland, on a Sunday at the time of church, where there's practically no one there, of course, on the road with you. And you drive along, and you are thinking, because there's nothing that is a provocation, there's nothing that causes you to think about immediate contingency. So 10, 15 minutes later, you suddenly wake up, in a manner of speaking. You have no remembrance of what you have seen or experienced during the last 10, 15 minutes, but you have been driving safely because you've been, so to speak, consciousness-wise on the autopilot, unless there's suddenly someone before you who steps on the brakes and you are immediately pulled back to the what you might call the immediate past. So this ability to constantly review your experiences, because they all have to be stored in the context of future contingencies that you may have to deal with, is what consumes most of our wakening time. And this constant planning is what consciousness does. And this is what consciousness seems to have been providing the organisms that have it with, namely the ability to predict and plan and optimize the odds for our survival. So we constantly take these items from the past, and for example, you have seen images, I suppose, from planet X31. I would say that it is extremely easy for us to conceive of a three-headed green dog on the surface of Mars. But we can only conceive of the things that we have actually experienced and stored in our memory, because we know of dogs' heads, we know of the color green, and we know of the surface of Mars from the pictures that have been sent to us. So this is easy to do, and we can think of whether or not the existence conditions for three-headed green dogs on Mars, they are optimal or not. But only those things that are actually in our memory form the basis of forming this consciousness, which is why science fiction films always, after a comparatively short period of time, appear incredibly dated when you look at them, because they were unable to conceive of all the things that hadn't happened yet at the time. I am particularly fond of a film called Back to the Future. And the first of that one came out in 1985. In 1985, I had just arrived in Montreal, Canada, and was working there. There were just this smattering of cell phones. There were practically no CDs. There certainly were no iPhones and iPads. And if you look at what is in this movie, they have conceived of flying taxis in 2015, which is 3 years from now, and unlikely to happen. But there are no cell phones. There are no cell phones, there are no iPads, there are no laptops, there are a number of things that are not in that. So it shows that unless it is stored in your memory, your conceptions of the future, of course, depend strongly on these items that you have actually experienced, which is also how consciousness builds up during development, from these elements of experience that are put into storage. And the way it happens is by these nerve cells. You probably have a fundamental understanding of nerve cells, but nerve cells are very standardized sort of cells. They consist of antennae, you can call them, or they're called dendrites, that receive impulses from other nerve cells. And then there's one long so-called axon that sends the results of the deliberation, so to speak, that this nerve cell has done to the next cell. And this is done by means of so-called electrical impulses. And I thought you would enjoy having a few tidbits of information like that. And electrical, here's a nerve cell, here's an axon, and these axons have an electrical difference between the inside and the outside, shown here. And suddenly, when an impulse passes, the sign of the electrical differences changes briefly and then goes back to what it was before. And this impulse, this change of the sign, travels rapidly down the axon. From first begins at the dendrites, and it goes to the cell body, and then it goes down the axon to the other end of the axon. And this is to some extent shown here. So at the end, what is interesting is that these cells are individuals, and the only way they speak to each other is by means of chemicals, molecules known as neurotransmitters. And these neurotransmitters are what allow us to influence what takes place in the nervous system. Here's one such cell, here's the axon, and here are these kissing points, also called synapses, in which there are molecules, and these molecules are released and then hit so-called receptors on the cell that they are talking to. This may sound a bit ho-hum to you, but it is true that most of what we do involve neurotransmitters in the environment as well as in our brains. When you think that this takes place inside your brain, think about odors and perfumes, not to speak of pheromones that you may not realize but are influencing your everything you do on a constant basis. These, to get an example of how prevalent this is, think about a dog. A dog is, in my opinion, but a nose on 4 legs. And dogs communicate by means of molecules that act like transmitters, neurotransmitters. We, to some extent, have preserved some of that. That's why our nose is sitting here, because these molecules, instead of coming from other nerve cells in our body, they may come from other bodies, as we understand, but they then enter the nerve cells that are hidden inside the nose, and there they carry out the same action, sort of action that these neurotransmitters perform between nerve cells. So I say when my dog goes out 4 times a day to check. I say to check its female. It is in fact doing that. It is in fact checking information from these molecules and acting on it, as you will know if you have a dog, and communicating by means of these molecules, the same way that these nerve cells do. But the thing is that the magnitude of this system, the magnitude that we need to realize, to be able to understand or have an idea of how enormous the task of understanding consciousness is perhaps indicated in this image from the brain. So we think perhaps of a few cells. There's one cell connected to another cell and so forth. This forms a network, the so-called connectome, and it ends by being thought. But that's not the way it really is. And the way it really is shown here. The number of these cells in one human brain is 100 billion, 10 to the 11th. And of these alone, the 20 billion are in the so-called cerebral cortex, in the outer 3 millimeters of the envelope that I talked about. And each of these, instead of having one synapse, as we write to make it simpler, have of the order of 10,000 of these synapses associated with each cell. So if we now were thinking about the world not having 7 billion inhabitants, but having 100 billion inhabitants, each of these inhabitants communicating continuously with 10,000 other humans on a constant basis, you would have an idea of the volume of communication that takes place in one human brain. And the question is, how many different states, let's say, of activity could you conceive of in such a system that has this number of contacts? And I always think of the brain as a room like this, with lamps like these. Instead of having 25 or 30 or 50 lamps, it has 100 billion lamps. And they can not only be turned off or on, they can also be adjusted to be more or less turned on. But if we just think about turning them off or on, we could think of one condition in which all the lamps except that one were on, and then all the lamps except these two were on, and then so forth and so on. And the number of different states of illumination in this room would have to be computed from these possibilities, and it is something of the order of 1 with 125 zeros after it. Different states. And that's only if it's on and off. If it's turned so more or less on, it becomes multiplied by orders of magnitude more than that. And that number of states of illumination that room would have is higher than the number of it's higher than the number of particles in the universe. And so it has been said, and rightly so, that in order to understand this, we have to understand the most complicated structure that has ever been observed. Perhaps the most complicated structure in the universe, unless there's a species out there that has developed even more. But there are calculations that say that this is at the limit of the thermodynamic possibilities in terms of the activity in 3 pounds of tissue of that magnitude. So it is an overpowering, and I shall try in the minutes that are left, I shall try to give some examples of how we understand how this works in terms of the consciousness. And this is only a knowledge that is of about 100 years old, and that has to do with the attempts to understand how the brain, how the different parts of the brain, how they actually worked, and what the different parts of the brain were for. And they started by looking at the different shapes of the nerve cells in the different parts of the brain and giving color to the landscape in which each of these colors reflected a particular type of nerve cell. And these countries, to some extent, delineated the extent of these differences between nerve cells. So we thought, yeah, if these nerve cells are indeed different, it's probably because they work slightly differently. It's probably because they do somewhat different work. So this map, which is 100 years old, is one that we still use in referring activity of the brain to these parts of the brain. For example, we say that the primary sense of vision is here in area 17, and with extensions into 18 and 19, and the center of language is in area 44 here and 45, and that's and we are still uncertain as to exactly how these places interact. This was on the outside of the brain, but it's also on the inside of the brain that these colors extend, and they are based on these differences between nerve cells that you can see on this map. These differences, the sort of the standard nerve cell that I showed you before is only found in a few places. They differ by as much as you can see on this map. They all basically work the same way, as far as we know, but the way they receive these impulses and the way they transmit the impulses to the next cells differ from place to place. And taking this into account, the first actual, these maps were inspired by the first drawings of brains that had been done 200 years ago, and by a German neuroanatomist who, for the first time, drew, as you can see, it's his drawing from 1810, for the first time drew these gyri and sulci in a manner which had some resemblance with reality. And he said he made these four statements about how these places work together, that moral and intellectual qualities are innate. Innate means inborn in those days. Their functioning depends upon organic supports. That is, that they have to have oxygen and glucose to work. The brain is the organ of all faculties, of all tendencies, of all feelings, the organ of the soul. This is an insight which is only 200 years old. And he then finally said the brain is composed of as many organs as there are faculties, tendencies, and feelings. And the question, of course, would then be, where is consciousness? And that is what consumed the neuroscientists in the following years, to think about where in this organ, or this assembly of organs that do different things because the nerve cells are different, do we find consciousness? Unfortunately, the ability to look into brain tissue by means of MR scanners and PET scanners and CT scanners, of course, didn't exist 200 years ago. So this Professor Gal, Franz Josef Gal, had the task of trying to find out exactly how do you know, how can we observe what takes place in each of these parts of the brain. And those who have good eyes can see that there are the numbers. The numbers are not the ones that I gave you on the other atlas, but he gave them numbers. Here's 20, XX, here's 19. Excuse me, here's 24 and 25 and so forth and 26. So the question is, what takes place in gyri number 20? Question mark. And he came up, or it may have been his pupil. Crazy ideas sometimes come from disciples rather than from the old man himself. He came up with the idea that if you work these parts of the brain well, if you're particularly endowed with a particular skill, you are perhaps musical, or you speak languages well, or you do other things well, or you have some of the lesser qualities, you are very sexual in your, or you steal, or you do other things. The better you are at these various things, the bigger these gyri will be. They will grow just as the muscles of your arms will grow when you use them. And therefore, these gyri will then press on the skull, and the skull will then be equipped with bumps corresponding to your personality. And these bumps can be recorded by something that looks like an old EEG scanner, but it's actually a head with pistons, and these pistons go down to measure the extent of bumps on your skull, and that was used in many cases to evaluate people's ability, for example, and also their whether or not they should be allowed to attend school. This is a girl who was being tested for whether or not she should be allowed to attend school based on the presence of bumps, and I'm talking about on the skull in this case. And and in fact, these maps look like this. And I've taken a brain with me, which I would like to show you. Actually, a skull, which is marked with these. You can see this is a skull. It's about 100 years old, and you can see these markings on the skull. This is someone that has tried to understand the personality of this person. And perhaps you could say that the forehead is perhaps a little flat, which was bad, because all the positive good things about your personality were here in the front, whereas the bad things were here in the back, which are particularly well developed here, which is why we still speak in Danish of having a high forehead, which means that you have a positive and good and moral personality, as opposed to having the back of the skull like a bull, in which case, of course, you are likely to harbor sexual predator propensities. But there was one thing that he did say, that language was likely to be associated with the frontal lobe here, because he had observed individuals who had protruding eyes and was at the same time very verbose, talkative, and therefore it was likely that the eyes were pushed forwards by the frontal lobes, in which this language skill was placed, the language center. And in fact, the first let's say attempt to look at the pathology of a person who had difficulty speaking happened about these 150 years ago, and it turned out that a person who was unable to speak had a defect here in that part, which is the one I called 44 or 45 a moment ago, which has since been called the speech center. I would like to spend a few more moments. Is that I see they're nodding down there. What? It's okay. In 1881, the quest for the seat of consciousness moved onto new techniques. And I said very few people have seen a normal living brain. In fact, this individual called Bertino had a defect in his skull, which allowed the researcher named Marceau to actually observe his frontal lobe with a pressure gauge, which then put a line on a drum, and he could then interact with this Bertino, who was almost a professional medical experimental subject by then. This all took place in Torino in northern Italy, so here are some of these lines, and here is the this is a timeline, and here is the pressure fluctuations in his frontal lobe at rest. But then the church bells start pealing, and this is in northern Italy, they're all Catholics, and church bells start pealing at noon, and you can see the pressure increases considerably and the fluctuations increase considerably, probably because Bertino, as the conclusion was, has a poor conscience, because he ought to be in church rather than sitting there in the laboratory of Professor Masso playing with the pressure in his frontal lobe. And then Professor Masso becomes a little cheeky, because he now asks Bertino, have you said your Ave Marias? And of course, this is in northern Italy, and they're Catholics, and we all sin, and we are all supposed to, probably on a regular basis, to say our Ave Marias. He obviously his conscience is poor, because the pressure increased enormously upon that question in his frontal lobe, because he obviously hadn't said his Ave Marias. And so the conclusion was that these moral evaluations, so to speak, took place in the frontal lobe. And then he asked him to also confirm that things having to do with intellectual activities also occurred in the frontal lobe. So he asked him to multiply 8 and 12, and you can see this is increasing. And he found a method of evaluating in a simpler way what happened in the frontal lobe upon various activities. Here's an example that is described by William James, although there's no photograph of it, but he described it in detail. A person is lying on this on an extremely well-balanced table, and then he's exposed to an experimental test. And this experimental test is an intellectual question, and the moment that happens, the thing falls as a sign of increased blood flow to the brain. And he concluded that intellectual and moral activities guide the activity in the frontal part of the brain. And this brings us to modern scanners, which are able to show, these modern scanners are able to show activity in the brain, and based not on bumps on the skull, but based on actual recording of activity, energy consumption, energy turnover in the human brain by means of positron emission tomography, which physicists know about positrons, and they can be recorded by detectors. So if you give foodstuffs or other items that emit positrons, you can actually see the emissions by these detectors. You can breathe a gas that emits positrons, for example, oxygen, 15, or you can eat glucose that has been labeled with something that you can see on these scanners. Actually, it's a comparatively old technique which has now been perfected. A modern PET scanner looks like this. Here's a person who's about to be her head placed in the PET scanner. Here's a little tube by which this particular foodstuff, glucose, is injected, which will then pass to the brain and show where in the brain the activity associated with specific intellectual tasks, where they take place. And the result is a very simple observation. Here we have a map of the glucose consumption. Brains only use glucose. Everything else we eat is converted to glucose for the brain. And here is in the resting state, which means that you're not looking at anything on a black screen. And here's an active state, which could be the state you're in now when you look at this exciting image. And then when you subtract the two from each other, you find that there's a little place here in the back of the brain in which there's an increased glucose consumption, and it could be an increased blood flow. And what that means is that this is where the visual cortex, this is the primary seat of vision, and that's not, of course, inexplicable that when you look at things, vision is particularly active in the back of the brain. And that's how, for example, it's possible to record what happens when you, for example, interact with language. And when you look at words, it's the visual cortex. when you listen to words, it's the auditory cortex. So this was in the temporal lobe, this was in the occipital lobe. When you speak words, it's the motor cortex of your lips and your tongue and your throat that is active. And then when you generate words, in this case when you generate verbs, you can see it's this area that I call number 44 that poor Monsieur Le Borgne did not have. There was a hole here confirming that this is where the language skill seems to at least be have a central or an important region. So this sort of confirmed the modularity of the brain. The modularity of brain is shown on here, and even philosophically, in 1983, the philosopher from Berkeley, Jerry Fodor, published a book, which the claim was, and he unfortunately included a phrenology bust on the front page of the book, in which he said that minds are modular. And of course, the question that is still unanswered: where is consciousness? And if the mind is modular, where is consciousness? And the ability to, for example, our ability to understand signals from the world. I'm not sure whether any of you are capable, whether there are any Japanese speakers here who are capable of deciphering what it says there, but these are just smudges to people who are not familiar with Japanese writing. It begins up here, Ike no misu, and then it goes on. And it's only when we transcribe, because of the knowledge that we have, the learning that we have. Japanese kids would have no difficulty reading that or speaking it aloud, but we need to have it translated like the water in the lake. Ike no mitsu, the water in the lake. That first is unclear and then clears, is like the mind of man. So this transcription of this is because our ability in this particular part of the brain to make the connection between the physical symbols here and these physical symbols for us, and then the meaning that we immediately decipher from this text. I would like to jump to, because I obviously took too much time for this, but the connections between these parts of the brain develop through our adolescence, from children to adults. And it's been possible with brain imaging, it's been possible to record the connections between different parts of the brain. And the frontal lobe, which is up here in children, is by and large unconnected to the sensory portions of the brain that I discussed, unlike an adult here. So if you subtract the two, you can see through development how these connections appear. And the ability to form these images that are part of our consciousness has been ascribed to this connectivity between the parts of the brain where our memories are controlled, called the hippocampus, and the frontal lobe that draw upon these memories in creating these images that are used to evaluate how the future contingencies are to be dealt with. And I'll give one final example of how the people who are familiar with old Norse mythology will know that these two birds are called respectively Hugin and Munin, and they serve for Odin to fly out and obtain information about the world and store it in his memory so he can make the correct conclusions and make the correct plans for mankind. That is Odin's task to do. And this is the final image, the way the activity in the frontal lobe is supposed to control this evaluation that the imagination serves has been shown by these imaging methods to cover essentially 3 areas in the frontal lobe. And the first of these drives consists in what do I want to do. And these drives, for example, I would like to eat, I would like to interact with my surroundings, perhaps I would like to fight off the enemy, I would like to reproduce. And these activities arise apparently spontaneously in this part of the frontal lobe. And this gives rise to another set of activities which are associated with the evaluation of the world around us if we are healthy, which answers 2 questions. How am I and how are others? And this activity is in the middle part here of the brain. And finally, apparently here in the bottom part of the frontal lobe is the question which is of an emotional conscience nature. What are the consequences? So when we form these drives to do something and we evaluate if we are normal by our empathy, the activity of ourselves and others, and thereby predict what the consequences would be and then change the course of action that we had planned, is what the consciousness apparently does. And there are a number of examples from the brain mapping experiments that I will, because of the time, not go through, but that shows these changes. And I will end by saying that these examples of evaluation of our interaction with the environment and people in it is particularly excessive in people who suffer from major depression, in which this particular part of the brain is, let's say, excessively associated with evaluating the consequences of actions. So in the end, we have talked about the earliest maps of the brain. We've seen an example of a particular, of the absence of the language area of the human brain. We have seen the maps of the various parts of the brain based on the morphology of nerve cells. We've seen a modern MR scan of the human brain. We have seen the map of where the language activity appears, and we have seen also a map of how this is integrated, or at least attempts to understand the integration. So all this is supposed to serve, and I've given a final picture. This is Diego Rivera's famous Man at the Crossroads, in which the ability of humans to take into account all the contingencies of mankind. Here are a number of various things. Here are soldiers, here are scientists, here are religious figures, here are various politicians. You see Trotsky here, you see Lenin here, and the final ability is that man is sitting at the seat of a motion machine that is his own body and uses consciousness as apparently implemented in the prefrontal lobe to determine the most optimal course of action for him or herself and the environment in the best of cases. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Albert. We're running a bit short on time, but there is time for a few questions. Yes? there.
Thank you. Given that the mind is this complex computer interacting, what would be the difference between a future simulation of consciousness in a computer and actual consciousness in a computer?
What you are, I think, referring to is if we build a copy of the brain that was exactly like the brain, but built with other types of materials, but have the same connectivity, connections between these different parts. What would be the difference between this computer making a prediction of what the future would look like, and then our brain's ability to do the same thing? Is that correctly understood?
Yeah. It was connected to our conscious is actually just catching up with us, with the present all the time.
Right.
That sounds like computing anyway.
But I think the key here is the conscience that has been instilled in us through the consequences of our actions throughout a whole period of development, which makes consciousness in that respect a little weird, because it's actually possible to evaluate and therefore choose a particular outcome on the basis of what the expected consequences for oneself and one's environment and other people are likely to be. So empathy tells us, it seems, what is a positive outcome and what is a negative outcome, and then we are in the position to be compelled to choose the most positive outcome because of the experiences we had. And I don't think you could rule out that a computer that, so to speak, was instilled with the same experiences could also choose the most positive of these projected outcomes. But the point is here is that it's through an interaction between individuals, which it is at least not understood how a computer would be able to make an emotional judgment about the consequences of its action, unless these emotional consequences somehow or another transformed into emotional consequences for a computer, which I'm not sufficiently creative to think what that would be.
Any other question?
Thank you, Professor, for that very interesting presentation. While one thing that was clearly established is that the brain makes the mind and the mind makes sense, I'm still not sure if your presentation clearly delineated where in the brain the consciousness lies. And the study of consciousness actually dates back thousands and thousands of years, if you were to consider what the sages have been doing in places like India. But if we were to settle for one corner of the brain, I'm not sure if that question is easy to answer, and that also wasn't quite answered in your presentation. So I'm wondering if there is an answer at all, if there is one particular part of the brain where consciousness lies.
I think the take-home message is more, and thank you for that question, I think the take-home message is more that it's all parts of the brain that through this connectivity that develops through from childhood through adolescence to the adult state, that this connectivity as part of this connectome, it's the connecting of all these parts of the brain where all these experiences are stored that are then brought forward to the executive part of the brain, which is the frontal lobe, and there lead to actions. First actions that are motivations, and then actions that are being evaluated through the experience of the consequences of these acts. So in that sense, it's the evolutionary advantage of consciousness is being able to draw upon these experiences, and it involves the entire brain. I actually think that the take-home message is that it's the entire brain that together creates this state that we perceive as consciousness. And whether or not, which means that you could probably not think of a particular part of the brain as being responsible, but the execution of the acts that are a consequence of being able to evaluate these various courses in your consciousness definitely is an activity that at least comes out of the frontal lobe. And in that case, I would say that it's the entire brain that is involved in the conscious evaluation of future time courses, which optimize the odds.
There was one more question here.
Thank you for presenting this beautiful and at the same time scary organ. And I learned that maybe I should take some CT scan to see if I have the language region existing, because I'm really bad in Danish. I'm here.
I can't see
Yes.
you. Where? Oh, there.
Yeah,
Yes,
I'm
yes,
here.
yes,
Yeah.
yes. Thank you.
I have a question. Probably you got it a few times before, but I think everybody experienced before déjà vu effect, and I would like to hear how you would explain that.
Yes, there's both déjà vu and jamais vu also have also, and these are of course malfunctioning, so to speak, of memory. And if you have a mechanism that in fact assigns or gives you the ability to draw upon specific experiences from the past, draw it out of your memory banks, these experiences in terms of images. Of course, the assignment of a particular sensation that you have had that experience before is different from the experience itself. So the déjà vu, which is kind of a faulty operation of that mechanism, because it activates a particular network which says this has happened before, as opposed to the opposite, in which case it mistakenly gives you the sensation that this has never happened before. So it is, and of course certain things that interfere with consciousness, disrupted consciousness or reduced consciousness, stupor, and so forth, is likely to increase the probability that such faulty conclusions from the networking. And it's of course also possible that neurodegeneration, diseases like dementia and so forth, will make those, because this connectivity, which concludes from that there's a mark in the particular network that is associated with that event, and that mark then activates your sensation. Let me say very briefly that the way I think of memory is that it's actually a physical alteration of in fact, probably the entire brain. And this plasticity we now realize is much more important than has been said before. That the brain that you had, that you leave this room with, is different from the brain you had when you came in here, which is both perhaps a scary and a happy thought. But that because of physical alterations in all of these neurons are physically altered by everything you have experienced. And this, so when you go back and, so to speak, review what has happened during the day, which may happen during dreaming, particular parts of dreaming, then that record, that here's a change, and so forth, can of course go wrong, or apparently goes wrong in some cases. And the more you visit a memory, the more you, so to speak, change it by the new memory, so it's not a stable one. And this can also contribute to these changes of déjà vu and jamais vu.
Okay, there was one last question.
Well, I'm glad you just talked about memory, because I was just going to ask, do you think, in your opinion, is memory a prerequisite for consciousness? If we didn't have memory, would we actually have a consciousness in our brain, in our mind?
There was one slide that flashed by here that said imagination, which has something to do with an image, and also Einbildung in German. But there are different forms of memory, and there's episodic memory, and there's linguistic memory, and there are other forms of memory. So it does differ, but generally speaking, consciousness is about images and associated feelings of things in the past that are brought to bear on future situations. But from the past alone, in recording this, if you did not have memories, you of a particular kind, or any memories, I'm not sure that the subjectivity and free will and communication would appear to you as consciousness. And in fact, there are examples of the famous patient, so to speak, H.M., who had both of his hippocampi removed surgically for intractable epilepsy. He, of course, had at least his memory of faces and people, and also considerable portions of his episodic memory disappeared. So when he met Brenda Milner in Montreal, who was his psychologist for 40 or 50 years, he had to be introduced to her on every day, every time he met her. And the question is such a person who was still able to drive a car and ride a bicycle, would such a person be called conscious? It depends on how you would try to extract that information from him, but I think you would definitely conclude that his consciousness, at least, was of a different and less developed kind than the one that you have on the basis of memories, which is, of course, what also makes dementia such a tragic event, because it's not necessarily that you lose your memories, but you lose the ability to extract them from the places to extract them because of particularly lots of activity in this part of the brain is called the hippocampus, where this is organized.
Okay, unfortunately, there's no more time for questions now, but you're, of course, welcome to talk to Albert privately around the bar and drinking a cocktail. So I have to move on. I will take a short break now, and after about 15 minutes, Soskunvar Ruberg is going to present a musical performance here. And don't forget, in 2 weeks, we have Science Cocktails again, and this time it's going to be about biosemiotics with Jesper Hofmeier. So, but before that, let's thank Albert for his presentation.